In the quiet English countryside, where ivy clings to crumbling stone walls and time seems to move at its own unhurried pace, there lies a secret. A secret tied not to whispers in the village or rumors in the marketplace, but to the death of a man whose life was as remarkable as it was mysterious. His name was Andrew Marsh, wealthy, eccentric, stubbornly intelligent. When he passed away, his family gathered eagerly, their eyes already shining with expectation of inheritance, of fortunes changing hands, of futures suddenly made golden. But what awaited them was not a treasure. It was a shock. The will, read aloud with solemn precision, left everything. The estate, the money, the legacy, not to his blood, not to his kin, but to an institution. The family gasped, tempers flared, suspicions ran rampant. Could the old man have truly meant to cut them all off? Or was there another will, hidden somewhere, waiting to be found? For amid the despair, one voice rose above the chaos. Violet Marsh, his niece. She insisted her uncle had promised her everything. She believed not just in his words, but in his character. He was a man who loved puzzles, who thrived on testing the cleverness of others. And she was certain he had not betrayed her, but had instead left behind a challenge only the sharpest mind could solve. Enter Hercule Poirot. With his immaculate suits, his perfectly groomed mustache, and his unmatched little gray cells, Poirot was never one to be fooled by appearances. Where others saw disappointment, he saw a game. Where others saw a closed door, he saw the faint trace of a keyhole waiting to be discovered. He understood something the rest of the family refused to admit, that the missing will was not simply lost, but deliberately concealed, its discovery meant to prove worthiness, intelligence, and resolve. This is not merely a tale of inheritance. It is a story of greed, of rivalry, of quiet jealousies that simmer just beneath polite smiles. It is a story of a man who sought to control his legacy from beyond the grave. And it is, above all, a story of Hercule Poirot's brilliance, his patience, his insight, and his unshakable belief that every riddle, no matter how carefully buried, leaves behind a trace. Tonight we follow him through the dim corridors of Enderby Court, through dust-covered libraries and firelit studies, through the words left unsaid and the silences that speak louder than confessions. This is the case of the missing will, and by the end you will see not only how the mystery unravels, but how human nature, in all its cunning and its folly, reveals itself when money and pride are on the line. The summer sky hung low with a haze that blurred the outlines of the countryside, as if nature itself sensed unease in the air. At the heart of it all stood Enderby Court, a house of stone and shadow, its tall windows reflecting the muted light of late afternoon. It was here that Andrew Marsh's family had assembled, their carriages crowding the gravel drive, their conversations sharp with curiosity and dread. The occasion was solemn, yet beneath the black crape and whispered condolences lay a single, undeniable truth. They were here for the reading of the will. The drawing room was heavy with expectation. Portraits of ancestors watched sternly from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to mock the assembled relatives as they shifted in their seats. Violet Marsh sat a little apart, her back straight, her gaze steady. She was not a woman easily intimidated. While her cousins exchanged nervous glances and muttered behind handkerchiefs, Violet's thoughts burned with a single conviction. Her uncle would not have abandoned her. He admired her independence, her refusal to bow to the shallow traditions that ruled the rest of the family.
If he had promised her the estate, then somewhere, somehow, his promise still lived. The solicitor cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was even, but every word seemed to slice through the air like a blade. The first few lines were formal, expected, but then came the blow. Andrew Marsh had left his entire fortune to an institution devoted to education. Not a penny to his family, not a room, not a book, not a single keepsake. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, all at once came the outrage. A cousin cried out in disbelief, another slammed his fist on the table, and someone muttered accusations under their breath. Violet remained still, her jaw clenched, her heart hammering, not with despair, but with certainty. This was not the end. When the storm of voices subsided, Violet rose. Her voice was calm, but its firmness cut through the room like a bell. She told them plainly that her uncle had spoken to her, that he had intended her to inherit. They scoffed, of course. To them she was grasping, inventing hope where there was none. But Poirot, who had been invited as both a guest and an observer, watched with interest. His sharp eyes missed nothing: the envy that flickered across one cousin's face, the forced composure of another, the nervous shuffling of feet that betrayed guilty knowledge. He saw not just grief or anger, but hunger, the hunger that only money could provoke. After the reading, as the family dispersed into corners of the house to whisper and conspire, Poirot approached Violet. She explained again what her uncle had promised, her words carrying the weight of someone who had rehearsed them many times in her mind. Poirot listened, nodding slightly, his mustache twitching with the faintest of smiles. "Mademoiselle, your uncle was, as you say, a man who enjoyed the puzzles, yes? Then perhaps this will is also a puzzle. One must not assume it is absent simply because it was not produced today. No. Sometimes the truth it likes to hide, but it leaves its traces." As he spoke, Poirot's gaze swept the room, the heavy curtains drawn too tightly, the dust disturbed on a shelf, the faint mark of ash in the fireplace, though no fire had been lit that day. To most, these details meant nothing. To Poirot, they whispered possibilities. If Andrew Marsh had left another will, he had hidden it with purpose. And if he had hidden it, then surely he had also left the means for someone worthy to find it. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Enderby Court in shadow. Inside, suspicion grew thicker with every passing hour. Greed had already begun to gnaw at the edges of civility, and the absence of inheritance loomed larger than grief itself. Yet Violet held fast to her belief, and Poirot, with his little gray cells already humming, knew this was no ordinary matter. The game had begun, and the first move had already been played. That night, Enderby Court seemed to breathe with its own uneasy rhythm. Corridors creaked under the weight of unseen footsteps, and the hush of velvet curtains smothered the house like a shroud. The family had retired to their respective rooms, but whispers carried through the halls, fragments of argument, sharp bursts of laughter that lacked any joy, and the brittle silence of grudges unspoken. To anyone else, it was the restless aftermath of a bitter disappointment. To Hercule Poirot, it was the atmosphere of concealment. He wandered not aimlessly, but with careful steps, his polished shoes clicking softly against the polished wooden floors. His destination was the library, a cavernous chamber lined from floor to ceiling with books bound in leather, their spines faded but proud. It was here, Poirot thought, that a man like Andrew Marsh would hide his secrets. For a mind so disciplined, so addicted to puzzles, the library was both sanctuary and stage. The fire had long gone out, leaving the room in shadows, yet Poirot noticed immediately the faintest curl of ash on the grate, as though something had been burned not many hours before. He bent, eyes narrowing. Too little ash for a log,
too dark for kindling. A page, perhaps, a letter, or the corner of a document someone wished to erase. He straightened, running a hand gently along the spines of the books. They yielded no answers, but the dust spoke in its own language. Here, a row untouched for years. There, a shelf where a single volume had been pulled out and replaced not long ago. Poirot made no move to disturb them. He preferred first to observe, to listen to the silent testimony of a room before putting it to the test. It was then Violet entered. She carried a candle, its flickering light painting her face in warm gold and deep shadow. She started slightly at seeing Poirot there, then smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed weariness. "Monsieur Poirot, you too cannot sleep?" He inclined his head. "For the detective, mademoiselle, the night is often the friend. In the quiet, the truth sometimes chooses to speak." They spoke softly, their words echoing gently in the vastness of the library. Violet told him again of her uncle's fondness for riddles, how he had once locked her out of her own room and left her to solve a string of clues before she could return. To her, the idea of a hidden will was not absurd, but entirely in character. Poirot listened, his eyes gleaming. Every detail about Andrew Marsh, however trivial, was another thread in the web. Suddenly, a sound interrupted them. The unmistakable creak of the library door shifting, then pausing. Someone had been listening. Poirot turned sharply, but the hall beyond was empty, the shadows deep. He said nothing, only gestured for Violet to remain calm, but inwardly his suspicion grew. If someone else believed a second will existed, then Violet was not alone in her quest. And where there was competition, there was danger. Later, when Violet had gone, Poirot lingered in the library alone. His gaze returned to the fireplace, the ash that spoke of secrets destroyed. He leaned closer, carefully sifting through the remains with the tip of a silver letter opener he had found upon the desk. At last, among the gray dust, he found a fragment, no larger than a fingernail, a piece of paper, its edges charred, yet one corner intact. A scrap of handwriting, looping and strong, unmistakably belonging to Andrew Marsh. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The fragment bore only 3 words: "The second key." He stood in silence for a long moment, the words sparking a dozen possibilities. A key could be literal, hidden somewhere within the house, or it could be metaphorical, a clue to a larger riddle. But either way, it meant one thing. Andrew Marsh had anticipated this very search. He had left behind breadcrumbs, daring the clever and the greedy alike to follow. As Poirot slipped the fragment carefully into his pocket, the wind rattled the windows, and the old house groaned in its sleep. Somewhere in the darkness of Enderby Court, a secret waited to be unearthed. And as the family dreamed uneasy dreams, Poirot's little gray cells had already begun to dance.
The morning at Enderby Court dawned pale and brittle, a light mist clinging to the lawns, as though the world itself wished to keep its secrets hidden. Breakfast was a strained affair. The long dining table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected not warmth or kinship, but sharp glances and unspoken rivalries. One could almost hear the crackle of tension beneath the clatter of china and the scrape of silver knives. Poirot, seated unobtrusively at the far end, took in every detail. For him, such gatherings were not mere meals, but theaters in which the human heart betrayed itself in 100 subtle ways. The cousins were restless. Charles, the eldest of them, held his fork with the grip of a man accustomed to control, but his eyes betrayed agitation. His inheritance had always been assumed, his authority unquestioned. Yet here he sat, stripped of his expected prize, forced into the company of equals, where once he would have been lord. His voice, when he spoke, carried the tone of someone forcing composure. "It is absurd," he muttered, "that our uncle should squander the family legacy on a pack of strangers. Education, bah! The Marsh estate belongs in Marsh hands." His sister, Clara, shushed him nervously, but the sentiment was shared by more than one around the table. Poirot observed, his mustache twitching as he dipped his spoon delicately into his coffee. Each face told a story. Clara, timid but watchful, seemed to shrink under her brother's outbursts, yet her eyes lingered too long on Violet, as though measuring her cousin's determination. George, another relation, laughed too loudly at trivial remarks, a brittle laughter that reeked of concealment. It was not joy, but deflection. And Margaret, seated stiffly at the far side, looked perpetually offended by the air itself, her thin lips pursed as if she bore secrets too delicate to expose. It was Violet, however, who drew Poirot's focus. Unlike the others, she did not complain or brood. She ate little, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Her calmness, her refusal to descend into bickering, only fueled the resentment of the rest. In their eyes, she was already the usurper, the one who dared to believe she had been chosen over them. They would not forgive her easily. After the meal, Poirot took the opportunity to wander with the family in the gardens, feigning idle conversation. It was here, among the trimmed hedges and gravel paths, that he began to prod delicately, as only Poirot could. With Charles, he asked of his uncle's views on tradition. The man blustered, insisting Marsh would never disinherit him willingly. Yet in his insistence lay desperation, a man clinging not to truth but to entitlement. With Clara, Poirot's questions were softer, almost paternal. Did she believe her uncle enjoyed games? She admitted shyly that he had, but her glance darted nervously toward her brother, as though speaking too freely might invite his wrath. George was less cautious. With a careless smile, he suggested Violet's claims were a fabrication, that she had invented this supposed promise in the hope of winning sympathy. Yet his hands fidgeted as he spoke, tugging at his cuffs, betraying a mind uneasy. Poirot noted every twitch, every hesitation. And Margaret, she said little, but her silence was heavy. When asked of her uncle's fondness for puzzles, she dismissed it coldly, as if the subject itself offended her. But her eyes narrowed ever so slightly at mention of the will, a flicker of something sharp and calculating. By the time the stroll was over, Poirot's little grey cells had begun to arrange the pieces. These were not mourners gathered in memory, but players on a stage, each driven by hunger, by fear, by resentment. A missing will was not merely a document to them, but the difference between power and powerlessness, between comfort and ruin. Each one, Poirot mused, had a motive to see it remain hidden or to find it first. That night, as the house settled once again into uneasy silence, Poirot sat alone in his chamber, the fragment of paper spread upon the table before him. "The second key," he murmured, repeating the words like a chant. The key might unlock not a door, but a truth. And perhaps, he thought, the key was not hidden in wood or iron at all, but in the hearts of those now circling each other like wolves. For if Andrew Marsh had left a riddle, it was not to be solved by chance, but by character. And already Poirot had begun to see which among them had the patience and which had the greed to play the game.
The house, with all its grandeur, seemed to shrink at night into something more intimate, more conspiratorial. By day, the sunlight softened its edges and gave the illusion of civility. But in darkness, when the firelight flickered and footsteps echoed in empty corridors, Enderby Court became what it truly was, a labyrinth of secrets. Poirot knew it well. He had walked through many such houses, each hiding the silent testimony of ambition, deceit, and fear. This one was no different. In his pocket, the charred scrap whispered its riddle, the second key. Poirot repeated it, as though the phrase itself might reveal its meaning. A man like Andrew Marsh, he reasoned, would not speak of keys carelessly. He had been a strategist all his life, fond of traps and diversions. The phrase must lead somewhere deliberate, a trail to be followed by those clever enough to see it. But where, Poirot wondered, was the first key? Without the first, how could one recognize the second? He returned once more to the library, his chosen hunting ground. The smell of old paper and polished oak clung heavily to the air. Poirot began with the desk, pulling open drawers one by one. They revealed nothing unusual. Pens, paper, a brass compass, and assortment of correspondence. But in the bottom drawer lay a small locked box, its lid unyielding. Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. A box without a key is an invitation. He tried the desk key, but it did not fit. Perhaps this was the first key, still hidden elsewhere. His inspection was interrupted by soft footsteps. Violet entered again, candlelight in hand. She looked at him with a curious mixture of trust and impatience. "Have you discovered anything?" she asked. Poirot held up the locked box. "A mystery within a mystery, mademoiselle. Your uncle, he was a man of puzzles. See here, a box that will not open, yet surely demands to be opened. It is perhaps our first key." Violet frowned. "But then what is the second?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Ah, that is the beauty. A clue that points not backward, but forward. To speak of a second key implies there is more than one. We must search for both, n'est-ce pas?" The following day, Poirot set about his task with greater purpose. He observed the family, noting where their eyes lingered as they moved through the house. Charles seemed oddly drawn to the study, lingering by the shelves as if hunting something not quite admitted. Clara, timid as ever, avoided the library altogether, as they would fear its very shadows. George prowled the halls like a restless animal, and Margaret, with her rigid posture, seemed always to know more than she let slip. Poirot used his methods subtly, asking harmless questions, feigning ignorance, all while planting small seeds. "I hear your uncle kept much locked away," he remarked casually to George. The man stiffened, laughed it off too quickly, and excused himself. Later, Poirot asked Clara whether her uncle had a fondness for hiding things. Her nervous nod was enough. By evening, Poirot was certain more than one of them believed a secret treasure still lay hidden in the house, and secrets, when believed, are rarely left alone. It was that night when the first trap was sprung. Poirot had left the library deliberately untidy, the desk drawer ajar, the locked box just visible within. He himself remained in the shadows, silent, waiting. Hours passed, the house quiet as death, until at last a figure slipped silently into the room. The intruder moved straight to the drawer, pulled it open, and reached for the box. In that moment, Poirot stepped from the shadows, his voice calm but cutting. "Ah, so we are not the only one curious about Monsieur March's secrets." The figure froze, then turned. Charles, his face pale in the candlelight. He stammered an excuse, claiming curiosity, but his hands trembled as he spoke. Poirot said nothing more, only escorted him out, the box still firmly in his possession. But as the door closed behind the retreating man, Poirot murmured softly to himself, "The wolves grow restless. Soon the second key will reveal itself, and with it the truth that each of them fears." By now, Enderby Court had become less a family home than a stage where each actor struggled to hold their mask in place. To the untrained eye, the cousins moved with civility, dining together, exchanging the expected courtesies. But Poirot, with his watchful gaze, saw through the thin veneer. Their words were polite, but their eyes betrayed hunger. Their smiles were tight, strained, and always, always directed at Violet with a sharpness she could not fail to feel. Poirot, ever deliberate, withdrew somewhat from their company, allowing their own impatience to betray them. He knew well that secrets revealed themselves not through confrontation, but through silence, through the pressure of waiting. And indeed, the cracks widened. George, once so full of nervous laughter, had grown quieter, his eyes darting constantly toward the locked box Poirot now kept in his possession. Clara whispered urgently with her brother Charles when they thought themselves unobserved, their huddled conversations heavy with schemes. Margaret, the proudest of them all, moved through the house as though she alone carried certainty. But Poirot noticed how often she studied the portraits on the walls, her gaze resting on one in particular, Andrew March in his youth, a hint of mischief still fresh in his expression. Poirot took note of these things with care, for in such details lay the truth. March had been a man of riddles, yes, but also of character. He had chosen his words precisely, the second key, not a riddle to frustrate, but a design to reveal worthiness. Poirot, seated one evening before the fire with Violet, spoke of this quietly. "Your uncle, he was a man of intellect, but more. He wished for his fortune to shape the future, not merely preserve the past. He speaks of keys not because he loved puzzles for their own sake, but because he believed the right heir would prove themselves by patience, by intelligence, by restraint." Violet listened, her face illuminated by the flames, her eyes full of a mixture of faith and fear. "And you believe he intended me to solve it?" she asked softly. Poirot inclined his head. "Not only to solve, mademoiselle, but to endure. That is the true test." As the days passed, Poirot allowed suspicion to ferment. He left small hints, suggestive remarks. comments about hidden compartments and overlooked passages. The effect was immediate. One night, footsteps again disturbed the silence of the house. Poirot, lying awake in his chamber, heard the faint groan of a floorboard in the corridor. Rising noiselessly, he followed. At the end of the hall, he found Margaret, candle in hand, pressing her fingers along the paneling of the wall. She started when she saw him, her face pale but her voice controlled. "I could not sleep. The air in this house, it is suffocating." Poirot merely bowed and let her pass, but he marked her desperation. The following morning, Poirot visited the library once more. There, with delicate precision, he examined the portrait of Andrew Marsh. The frame, he noticed, was slightly misaligned. With a gentle push, it swung outward, revealing a shallow recess. Within, a small brass key gleamed dully in the dim light. Poirot plucked it carefully between his fingers, his moustache twitching with satisfaction. So, the first key, and now the second must surely follow. But even as he held it, he sensed movement behind him. Turning, he caught sight of Clara in the doorway, her eyes wide, her lips parted, as though she had stumbled upon something she should not have seen. She said nothing, only retreated swiftly, her skirts whispering against the wood. Poirot tucked the key into his pocket, understanding well the danger now. Word would spread among the cousins, whether Clara intended it or not. The balance of the game had shifted. They would know he was closer to the truth, and desperate men and women could be driven to reckless acts when they felt the prize slipping from their grasp. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Poirot watched them with the quiet satisfaction of a man who already held more than they realized. Their faces, tense and restless, told him the storm was coming. He only needed to wait a little longer, and the truth, like the missing will, would step into the light.
The evening stretched long and uneasy, the house cloaked in that peculiar silence which comes not from peace, but from suppressed unrest. Each cousin sat stiffly at the dinner table, their forks moving but their minds clearly elsewhere. Violet tried to keep the conversation polite, but her voice faltered against the heavy air. It was Poirot who provided the only true calm, speaking in gentle tones about the weather, about trivialities, as though oblivious to the storm simmering around him. Yet behind his mild eyes lay sharp calculation. He knew the end game approached. The discovery of the brass key had changed everything. Though he said nothing of it to the family, Poirot understood that its existence would soon become common knowledge. Clara had seen him with it, and secrets in such a household spread like fire in dry grass. Already George's eyes darted toward him during dinner, suspicion written plainly on his face. Charles drank more than usual, his words growing looser, his temper shorter. Margaret, though outwardly composed, tapped her fingers impatiently against the tablecloth, her rigid control betraying the nerves beneath. After dinner, Poirot excused himself, returning once more to the library. He seated himself before the desk and placed the brass key beside the locked box. He did not yet use it. Instead, he let the object rest in plain sight, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It was bait, carefully laid, for he knew human nature too well. What is visible and forbidden draws more strongly than what remains hidden. So he sat, waiting, patient as a spider in its web. It did not take long. The door creaked subtly, and Charles appeared, his face flushed, his manner tense. "You have something that belongs to this family," he said roughly. Poirot regarded him with mild amusement. "Monsieur, you mistake yourself. What belongs to this family, it is justice, and justice will be served in its proper time." Charles stepped forward, fists clenched, his voice rising. "You think you're clever, but I know what you're doing. You're hiding it, the will. My uncle meant for us to share his fortune, not hand it whole to Violet." Poirot raised a hand, calm but firm. "Your uncle meant for the worthy heir to inherit. That is not the same as the greedy heir." His words struck Charles like a slap. For a moment anger twisted his features, and Poirot almost thought he might strike. But then the man faltered, his bluster collapsing into muttered curses as he stormed out of the room. Poirot remained still, unshaken. The trap was closing. Later that night, another visitor came, Clara this time, her timid figure framed by the door. She did not speak at first, only stared at the desk where the key still rested. Poirot, with a gentleness rare for him, beckoned her forward. "Mademoiselle, you are frightened, yes? But not of me. Of them, your cousins, they frighten you." She nodded, lips trembling. "I only want peace," she whispered. "I don't care about the money. But Margaret, George, they won't stop. They won't stop until—" She broke off, unable to finish. Poirot leaned closer. "Then you must trust me. Say nothing, do nothing. Only wait. The truth, it comes soon." When she had gone, Poirot finally turned to the box. With deliberate care, he slid the brass key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The lid opened with a soft click, revealing a single folded sheet of paper. Not the will itself, but another note in Marsh's hand. Poirot unfolded it, his eyes narrowing as he read. "The second key lies where the sun never shines, but the truth shall dawn only for the patient." Poirot's mustache twitched with satisfaction. Another riddle, yes, but one that confirmed his suspicions. Marsh had intended this game as a sieve to separate the worthy from the unworthy, and the cousins, by their own desperation, were already failing the test. Poirot replaced the note, closed the box, and left both it and the key upon the desk once more. He had what he needed. The heirs, blinded by greed, would reveal themselves in time. All that remained was to watch the storm break, and at the right moment step in to deliver the truth with the precision only Hercule Poirot could command.
The night drew down heavy upon Enderby Court, the old house creaking with every shift of the wind. Within its walls, tempers had frayed past civility, and the cousins eyed one another with thinly veiled hostility. Violet, pale but resolute, kept to her room, unwilling to become further entangled in their suspicion. Poirot, meanwhile, prepared for the inevitable. The trap he had laid was simple, elegant, and cruel in its own way. He had left the key and the box unguarded, visible, irresistible. It was only a matter of time before greed overcame restraint. That time came just past midnight.
Poirot, listening from the shadow of the landing, heard the faint scrape of the library door. He descended silently, his steps precise, until he stood unseen in the gloom. Inside the library, Margaret bent over the desk, her hands trembling as she reached for the key. Her face, so composed by day, was stripped bare of dignity now. She fumbled with the lock, muttering to herself. But before she could succeed, another figure burst in. George, eyes blazing, his voice harsh with accusation. "You think you can take it for yourself. It belongs to all of us." The two fell into a furious quarrel, their voices rising, each denouncing the other's greed. In the chaos, Charles appeared as well, his expression dark, his patience gone. The cousins faced one another in a triangle of suspicion and rage, the box caught between them like the very prize they sought. And just as their voices reached a fever pitch, Poirot stepped from the shadows. "Enough!" His voice cut through the air like a blade. The cousins froze, their faces paled, their guilt exposed. Poirot walked forward unhurried, every movement precise. He placed a hand upon the box, reclaiming it from their grasp. "So, you have all shown yourselves. Monsieur Marsh, he planned this well. He knew his fortune would reveal the truth, not in the discovery of the will, but in the unveiling of character." They stared at him, dumbstruck. But Poirot pressed on, relentless. The brass key, the riddles, they were never the true test. They were merely the stage. Marsh wished to see who among you would act with patience, with dignity, with intelligence, and who would succumb to greed, to suspicion, to desperation. You have revealed yourselves clearly. Charles, with your threats, George, with your temper, Margaret, with your schemes in the dark, and Clara. He paused, his gaze softening as he turned to the timid cousin who had entered behind the others, her eyes wide with tears. "Clara, you alone came to me in honesty. You alone wished not for wealth, but for peace. You alone proved yourself worthy." Gasps filled the room. Margaret's face hardened. George cursed under his breath. Charles muttered denial. But Poirot, unshaken, withdrew the folded note from the box and held it aloft. "The second key, my friends, is not of brass or iron. It is of virtue. Where the sun never shines, that is in the human heart, hidden from the world. And in the patient heart the dawn of truth arrives. Marsh left no puzzle to be solved with cleverness alone. He left a moral, a lesson, an inheritance not of gold, but of justice." At this, Violet stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. Then it was not me." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, mademoiselle. Your uncle admired your strength, yes, but he sought humility. He left his fortune to the one who desired it least, who sought not to seize, but to endure. Clara is the true heir." Gasps filled the room. Margaret's face hardened. George cursed under his breath. Charles muttered denial. But Poirot, unshaken, placed the paper in her hands with solemn gravity. "Your uncle was a wise man. He saw beyond ambition. He chose you not for your power, but for your goodness. That is the missing will, not lost, but hidden until its rightful time." The cousins stood shattered, their schemes undone. Clara, trembling, whispered her gratitude, and Poirot, satisfied, smoothed his moustache and turned away. It is finished. Justice, it always finds its way. And with that, the House of Secrets at last fell silent.
And so, dear friends, the mystery of the missing will reaches its end. Another puzzle unraveled, another reminder that human greed often hides more deeply than locked boxes and coded riddles. Hercule Poirot once again proves that truth, when revealed, is as much about character as it is about cleverness. If you enjoyed this journey through deception, suspense, and revelation, be sure to stay with us for more stories that test the limits of reason and the depths of the human heart. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the greatest mysteries are not written on paper, but within the choices we make. Until the next case, au revoir.